Thank you for joining us at the Generation Green 2021 Youth Conference. This session is brought to you by Sasha from Conservation Halton. Sasha will be presenting a session on carbon sequestration. In this session, Sasha will go over the basics of carbon sequestration and how it is being used to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Canada and all over the world. You will learn what you can do at home, at school, and in your community to adapt to climate change, increase greenhouse gas absorption to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. Enjoy.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm going to be talking about carbon sequestration here today. And I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of the land. So Halton, as we know it today, is rich in history and modern traditions of many First Nation and Métis. From the Anishinaabe to the Attawandaron, the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Métis, these lands surrounding the Great Lakes are steeped in Indigenous history. As we gather today on these treaty lands, we have the responsibility to honor and respect the four directions: land, waters, plants, animals, ancestors that walked before us, and all the wonderful elements of creation. I would like to acknowledge and thank the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations for sharing their traditional territory with us. So a quick summary of the presentation today is I'll do a little intro on who I am. Since we're not together in person, you'll get a chance to see me, and I'll talk a bit about what Conservation Halton is, and then we'll go into carbon sequestration. I'll focus on forests, and then we'll talk about things you can do to reduce your emissions and increase carbon sequestration. So here I am. My name is Sasha Benevides. I'll be presenting to you today. I've worked with Conservation Halton for over 10 years now, and a real focus of my work is helping people in the community get opportunities to be environmental stewards. So that could be through activities like tree planting or invasive species removals or community programming. So you may have heard of the Halton Children's Water Festival or even participated in Stream of Dreams, so the wooden fish on the fence. Those are things that I get to do with work. I think I have a pretty cool job, but I'm really excited to talk about climate change. So this is one of those other workshops that I get to host as the community outreach coordinator. Now about Conservation Halton. So Conservation Halton was established in 1956 by local municipalities and the province to manage natural resources and protect communities from flooding and erosion after Hurricane Hazel devastated the GTA in 1954. So a lot of people living in Halton today aren't familiar with the history, but there was a natural disaster in this area on October 15th, 1954, and that was Hurricane Hazel. It dropped over 280 millimeters of rain, so that's over 11 inches in a 48-hour period. So you can see up here in the top right, this is actually a photo from the City of Toronto archives, and you can see the people standing on the roofs of their homes. As you can imagine, with that amount of rain and winds that hit as high as 110 kilometers an hour, roads and bridges were washed away, thousands were left homeless, and tragically 81 people perished. So the total cost of Hurricane Hazel's destruction in Canada would have come to an estimated $1 billion today. So it was a pretty significant historical event, not just because it was so devastating, but also because it highlighted the need to manage our watersheds. And you may recognize Conservation Halton from our 7 parks, so places like Mount Nemo, Kelso or Glen Eden, Mountsburg, Crawford Lakes. These are all conservation parks that we manage. You may have seen our educational programs, but we do much more than just that. So we monitor and enhance our environmental health of the watershed. We do watershed management. We manage flood plains and flood control. It's a pretty dynamic organization. And climate change, like everything we do, touches on climate change in some way. So this presentation is very in line with the work that we do at Conservation Halton, because we want to mitigate the effects of climate change. So carbon sequestration, what is it? So it is the process of capturing and storing atmospheric carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide is just one of the greenhouse gases. There are several. Some are more popular than others. You may have heard of methane or nitrous oxide or chlorofluorocarbons. These are all greenhouse gases, and they are not necessarily bad. Having those in our atmosphere are actually a good thing because they make our plant livable. However, when they are out of balance, that's when we can see consequences or some negative impacts in our world, like rising temperatures. And carbon dioxide can be stored in plants, soil, can even be stored deep underground in geological gaps or in the ocean. But there are three main methods or techniques for capturing and storing carbon, and that is geological, technological, and biological. So I'll go over those very briefly. So geological sequestration. So carbon dioxide emissions get captured, usually from a power plant or a factory. And before they're released, they're captured and then pumped into a sealed rock formation. So you can kind of see here, these are the buildings, and then the carbon dioxide is pumped down below the ground, and that's usually like over a mile deep. And this is technology that has actually been happening for quite some time. There is an operation in Norway that's been in operation since 1970, or since the 1970s. So this isn't new. Actually, one of the largest geological carbon capture and storage facilities operates out of Canada. It's actually in Saskatchewan. It's called the Weyburn Project, and it can inject up to 2 tons of carbon dioxide a year. And that's roughly the same greenhouse gas emissions as the province of Prince Edward Island, just to give you a comparison there. And there are risks and benefits with geological sequestration, just as there are with any of the methods of carbon sequestration. However, currently the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, or the IPCC, which is like a leading climate change information and research group, they claim that the risks for these techniques do not outweigh the risks of us continuing on the path that we are on. There's a lot of irreversible damage that can happen with continued climate change. So I did want to point that out. Another form of carbon sequestration is technological sequestration. So that's using technology to remove carbon dioxide. So scientists are constantly exploring new ways to help us with our climate change problem. And where this comes into play usually is with like an industrial process. So people can convert carbon dioxide emissions into items like plastic or concrete or biofuel. This photo here is actually from a Canadian direct air capture facility. So they are converting carbon from the air. So they're not attached to another facility like with the geological sequestration. This is just taking air from around the facility and converting it into a biofuel. And this is just a testing site. So it isn't a large scale operation. Right now, they are pulling about a ton of carbon a day. And if this technology were scaled up, a larger plant could capture up to 1 million tons of carbon dioxide a year, which is the equivalent to the emissions of 250,000 of your average car. Now, this technology is interesting too because it has the potential to be negative emissions. So that's when you're removing more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere than you're putting out. And in comparison, this facility to another one, there is another company in San Antonio, Texas. They have a testing site that's been operating since 2014, and they capture over 75,000 tons of carbon dioxide a year. And that's from a cement plant. So they convert the carbon dioxide emissions from that plant and turn it into other products such as sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, which is pretty much baking soda. Biological sequestration. So this is, I would say this is probably the most popular. Everyone says go plant a tree, and that is a form of biological sequestration. So this form of sequestration refers to storing carbon in a natural carbon sink like trees, plants, soil, and aquatic environments. I feel like sometimes oceans are forgotten about, but oceans are a major carbon sink. They hold up to 25% of human-induced carbon. And if you've ever heard of ocean acidification, that's an element to oceans sequestering carbon. So when our greenhouse gases are out of balance, like they are now, excess carbon mixes with the ocean water and turns it acidic, which is ocean acidification. And this negatively impacts coral reef and ocean wildlife because when the ocean's that acidic, it inhibits skeletal growth, which is a big negative. Also, like I said, the most popular carbon sequestration is photosynthesis through trees and plants. They can absorb carbon dioxide when they grow, and then they emit oxygen. And that's often why they're called the Earth's lungs, because they take in our carbon dioxide and then they emit oxygen, which you and I get to breathe. Now, with forest carbon sequestration globally, the forests and their soil, because that is part of a forest ecosystem, is the soil. They help stabilize the planet's carbon. They act as a major carbon sink, and they're a crucial part of the carbon cycle. Forest ecosystems absorb carbon in their biomass. And when I say biomass, I mean things like the leaves, the branches, the trunk, and the roots. That's where the carbon is being stored. But it can also be stored in leaf and needle litter. So when a tree loses its leaves in the fall, that's considered an area where you can hold carbon. Deadwood, as well as the soil. So as the trees grow and decay, there's a cycle of carbon there. Now, an interesting thing about trees is it matters what type of tree you have. Like the amount of carbon you can sequester is very tree dependent. So typically a fast growing tree like a birch or a poplar, so birch are those like a paper birch or those white trees we often see in the forest, the paper-like bark, or a poplar, they can sequester more carbon at first because they are fast-growing species. So they quickly grow and develop their trunk and branches, and that's where they're storing all that carbon right at the beginning of their life. Now, when they eventually fall or die, that carbon then becomes a source again, right? It's that big carbon cycle. Now, a technique used by paper and pulp companies is to plant fast-growing trees like a poplar, and then in 10 or 15 years, they will harvest it and use it for their wood products. But they are sequestering carbon when they're the most efficient at the beginning of their life with that fast-growing technique. Now, for a slow-growing tree, so that's something like an oak, they are often considered like a more stable tree for carbon sequestration because they live so long, and they also grow larger. So they're sequestering more carbon as they age and for a longer period of time. So sometimes oaks can live for hundreds of years, and there are other slow growing trees that can live for way more. So those trees are holding, not only absorbing carbon, but they're holding the carbon in their structure, their roots, the leaves, the trunk for a longer period of time. Now, there are threats to our forests that would affect their ability to sequester carbon, but forests typically can help maintain our carbon balance, but they can become a carbon source when they are disturbed or threatened. So unfortunately, in Canada from 2002 to 2018, our managed forests were actually a carbon source. So they emitted more carbon than they took in. And that's due to the 1.4 million hectares of area burned. Forest carbon is released during forest fires. So when trees burn or when they decay after being cut down or die from an insect attack, so think of the emerald ash borer affecting our ash here in Halton. If a tree unfortunately dies for those reasons, or they're burnt, they are going to be emitting carbon. Now, I do like to stress that not all forest fires are bad. Forest fires can actually be a natural part of a forest ecosystem because they help with seed dispersal. So a species like jack pine, they need a fire. But also forest fires can help open up canopy for new growth, and the burnt plant matter is like biochar and it helps with the soil. So it's not all negative. However, fires caused by human negligence, so like the 2016 fires in Fort McMurray, Alberta, I would consider those an unnatural forest fire. That was actually the largest natural disaster in Canadian history, cost almost $9 billion, just those fires in 2016, and for sure contributed to the fact that our forests were a carbon source that year. Now, deforestation, clear cutting, and not leaving ground cover can also degrade soil, reducing a forest's ability to sequester carbon too. Now, how do you protect our forest ecosystems? Because there are ways to make our forests more efficient at sequestering carbon. And I would say a big or a key element to that is sustainable forest management. So that should also include methods that respect and meaningfully involve Indigenous knowledge. But by sustainably managing forests, we can increase their ability to sequester carbon. And when you're helping a forest, or if you're properly managing a forest, you're also helping a whole bunch of other ecosystem services. So things like air quality, water quality, increasing biodiversity. You're also acting as a forest also acts as a source of food or shelter for wildlife. So you're getting many benefits from a forest, not just carbon sequestration. It's all connected. And this is why Conservation Halton has strategic forest management plans. So we've planted over 4.4 million trees since 1956, and we've also contributed to building forest canopy cover by more than 24% across our watershed. And these are elements of forest management. Now, afforestation is creating a new forest, basically. I believe afforestation, you can only create a new forest if there's been no trees within 100 years on a site. But planting new trees and improving forest health can be done through thinning and prescribed burns as well. They both can help increase forest carbon in the long run. So harvesting and regenerating forests can result in a net carbon sequestration in wood products and new forest growth as well. So these elements here, so sustainably managing a forest, creating new forests, reducing deforestation, so cutting or reducing the amount of trees that are cut down, or increasing how much you replant, and improving soil health. These are all things that are actually suggested to be the most cost-effective solutions to reducing the impacts of climate change. And that's something that you'll find in the IPCC report, is that they suggest that these are more cost-effective. Now, soil, this is something that's actually, it's very neat that it's been getting more popular recently, because it is a key component to forest carbon sequestration too. Because forest soil can store up to 50% of a forest carbon. So here is a chart of all of North America's carbon stocks from, I believe it's 2018. And you can see here that soil counts for almost 20,000 of Canada's entire carbon stock. So you hear a lot about planting a tree on your property to sequester carbon or to help with climate change, but you can also help out your environment by taking care of your soil as well. And this applies too for agriculture, so doing things like cover cropping, crop rotation. Agricultural land can also play a huge role in absorbing carbon through producing better soil, but I will be focusing on forests here, or focusing on soil and focusing on soil outside of a forest, apparently. So You can work on soil on your own property, so doing things like never leaving your soil bare. So that means not raking leaves or grass clippings, letting them sit there and kind of cycle into the natural landscape of your yard. And of course, not everyone's going to have a yard, but if you do, these are some great techniques. You can let your grass grow longer and help let it absorb more carbon that way. And then you can plant species with larger root masses. So if you can see in this photo here, this is grass, and you can see the roots do not go very deep. But if you plant other species with a deeper root system, you're going to be able to absorb more carbon. And that's like this species here, little blue stem to the right. That's a great carbon fixer there. Now, the big question is, which method is best? And that one's tricky, because there are a range of technologies. So this is another figure from the IPCC, including IPCC information. So there's a range of technologies. There's a lot of research and development. And some of these I didn't have time to go into, like biochar and enhanced weathering. Each of these has their own risks and rewards. For example, sequestering carbon underground in rock near fault lines could trigger earthquakes, which is not great. Or if we invest purely in planting trees, that could increase price of land, which would negatively affect our food security, which is also not so great. So the reality is we need we need everything we can get, pretty much. We need a lot of options. There is no single solution. We want to manage climate change in a diverse way. So that's focusing on all the options available to us to sequester carbon, as well as not forgetting to aggressively lower our greenhouse gas emissions as well. We need to have a really holistic approach here. So other ways you can help are educating yourself. So I like to begin and stress this action because there are the fewest barriers with it. I know a lot of suggestions people give for climate change mitigation and adaptation. There's a great deal of privilege in those, like having a garden or having owning a lot of property or being able to plant gardens. So educating yourself is relatively easy and has less barriers than some of the others. Voting is great if you're able to, or just getting civically involved. So you don't have to be scared of your politicians. Most people get into public service because they want to help their community. So getting engaged and sharing your voice, even if you're not able to vote, you can still, your voice is still meaningful and it should be heard. Other things are walking and biking, reducing your fossil fuel demands. You can support local economies or shop local. That's great. Eco gardening, including some of those items I mentioned earlier. You can also reduce your meat consumption, or you can support farmers using regenerative techniques instead. And that just creates a bigger demand for those techniques, which can be really helpful for soil and soil carbon sequestration. And these are some of the sources I used in my presentation. And I just wanted to thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much for listening to Sasha talk about carbon sequestration. If you want to take climate action, don't forget to register for the project launch to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. You can find the registration link on the main page.